The silence was the loudest thing in the room. It was a thick, suffocating blanket woven from her father's rigid back and her mother's averted gaze. Clara stood before them in the drawing room, the polished mahogany and velvet upholstery feeling like a world she had only ever visited, not one she had lived in. She was 17, and her life was over. "It is done," her father, Mr. Alistair Finch, said. His voice was as cold and hard as the St. Louis winter rattling the window panes. He did not look at her. He looked at a spot on the wall just over her shoulder, as if she were a stain he was trying to ignore. "Arrangements have been made." He placed a small, folded packet on the table between them. A one-way ticket for a westward wagon train. A brittle, yellow deed to a piece of land in the Montana Territory. A paltry sum of money that felt more like an insult than an aid. The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but sharp as a shard of glass. Ruined. The word had been whispered by housemaids, hissed by her mother in a rare moment of fury, and finally delivered with chilling finality by her father. She had ruined herself with Mr. Abernathy, a man of power and wealth, a man with a wife and a reputation that glittered like a freshly polished coin. The truth was a darker, uglier thing. It was the memory of a hand over her mouth, of a grip like iron on her arm in the quiet of a garden party. It was the sickening sweetness of whiskey on a man's breath and the terror that had frozen her voice in her throat. It was not her fault, but in this world of polished floors and starched collars, the truth was a commodity, and hers was worthless. Mr. Abernathy was important. She was disposable. Clara looked at her mother, a woman who had once taught her how to press flowers and stitch her name onto linen. Her mother's hands were clenched in her lap, her knuckles white. She would not meet Clara's eyes. That was the deepest cut of all, the silence of her mother. The woman who should have been her staunchest defender was a betrayal that hollowed out her insides, leaving nothing but a cold, aching void. "You will leave in the morning," her father stated. "Your presence here is a stain on this family's honor." Clara did not beg. She did not cry. The tears had frozen somewhere deep inside her. She simply nodded, picked up the packet from the table, and walked out of the room. Her footsteps made no sound on the thick oriental rug. It was as if she were already a ghost. The journey west was a long, grinding descent into a new kind of hell. The wagon was cramped and smelled of unwashed bodies, stale food, and dust. The relentless creaking of the wheels and the snapping of the driver's whip became the rhythm of her days. She sat huddled in a corner, a gray shawl pulled over her fine but now soiled traveling dress, speaking to no one, the other passengers, families full of hope for a new life. Gave her a wide berth. They could smell the shame on her, the pungent odor of a woman cast out. St. Louis, with its gaslights and brick buildings, faded into a distant memory. The world flattened out into an endless sea of grass under a sky so vast it felt like it could swallow her whole. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a merciless sun. She ate when she had to, tasteless hardtack and salted meat, and drank tepid water from a cask that grew warmer and staler with each passing mile. At night, when the wagon circled and the campfires flickered, she would lie on her thin bedroll and stare at the stars. They were different out here, brighter and colder, like chips of ice scattered on black velvet. They offered no comfort. They only made her feel smaller, more insignificant. She thought of the cabin described on the deed, a place left by a great-great-uncle she had never known. Her father had called it an inheritance. She knew it was a sentence. The journey grew harder as the plains gave way to rugged foothills and then the jagged, imposing teeth of the mountains. The air grew thin and sharp, and the nights carried a bite that sank into her bones. Her health, already fragile from the shame and the poor conditions of the trail, began to fail. A cough settled deep in her chest, a dry, rattling sound that shook her thin frame. When the wagon train finally reached a small, muddy settlement at the foot of the mountains, the driver pointed a calloused finger toward a barely visible trail winding up into the timberline. "Your path is that way," he said, his voice devoid of pity. He unloaded her single trunk with a thud, and before she could fully comprehend that this was it, the end of the line, the wagon was rumbling away, leaving her in a cloud of dust. She stood alone, the town behind her, the wilderness ahead. She paid a man with a tired-looking mule to haul her trunk up the treacherous path. The journey took the rest of the day, a brutal climb over slick rocks and through dense, dark forests of pine and fir. The air grew colder. Flurries of snow, impossibly early for the season, began to drift down from a sky the color of slate. When they finally reached the plot of land, the man grunted, dropped her trunk beside a skeletal-looking pine, took his money, and left without a word. And Clara saw her new home. The word cabin was a kindness. It was a carcass. The structure leaned to one side as if a great hand had tried to push it over. The roof sagged in the middle, a gaping hole showing the gray sky above. Logs, blackened with rot and slick with moss, had crumbled away from the foundation, leaving gaps big enough for a wolf to crawl through. The door hung from a single leather hinge, and the window was a jagged, empty eye. A wave of nausea and despair washed over her, so powerful it buckled her knees. This was not a shelter. This was a grave. The land around it was no better. The ground was hard and rocky, choked with weeds and shadowed by looming pines that blocked out what little sun there was. Her inheritance, her exile. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat, but she ruthlessly pushed it down. Panic was a luxury. Panic would get her killed. She forced her shivering body into motion, her mind clinging to the simple, immediate tasks of survival. She dragged her trunk inside, the rough floorboards groaning under the weight. The inside smelled of damp earth, decay, and animal droppings. A crude stone fireplace stood against one wall, and a rickety table and a single three-legged stool were the only furnishings. With trembling hands, she unpacked the sight of her belongings: a few dresses, a silver-backed brush, a book of poetry, was so absurdly out of place that a harsh, dry sob escaped her lips. Her first task was fire. Her hands, soft and pale, were clumsy and useless as she tried to gather damp kindling. Splinters drove under her nails, and the bark scraped her skin raw. It took her an hour of frustrating, tear-streaked effort before a tiny, hesitant flame caught. She huddled over it, feeding it small twigs, treating it like the most precious thing in the world. Next was the roof. Using a small hatchet she found rusting near the woodpile, she tried to chop branches to cover the hole. The handle was rough, and within minutes, blisters rose on her palms. They broke, weeping clear fluid that stung in the cold air. Her fashionable dress, the last remnant of her old life, caught on a branch and tore from hip to knee. She ignored it. The food she had purchased in the settlement was a cruel joke. The bacon was rancid, the flour was weevilled, and the dried apples were covered in a fine, gray mold. She threw it all out, her stomach clenching with a hunger that was now laced with real fear. All she had left was a small bag of beans and some coffee. For 3 days, she fought. She worked until her muscles screamed and her blistered hands bled. She patched the walls with mud and moss, a futile effort against the wind that whistled through the countless cracks. She managed to boil a handful of beans, the smoky, tasteless meal doing little to quell the gnawing hunger. The snow fell intermittently, a light dusting at first, then with more conviction, blanketing the dead ground in a thin layer of white. The world was growing quieter, colder, shrinking until it was just the rotting cabin and the suffocating forest. Her cough worsened, turning into a deep, hacking rattle that left her breathless and dizzy. A fever began to burn behind her eyes, making the trees sway when she stood and the floorboards tilt beneath her feet. She would wake in the night, shivering violently under her thin blankets. her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. She was losing. The wilderness was patient, and it was winning. On the fourth day, she woke to a world of white. A heavy snow had fallen overnight, burying everything in a thick, silent blanket. The fire was dead. She was too weak to venture out for more wood. The cold was no longer just in the air. It was inside her, a deep, cellular chill that even the fever could not touch. Lying on her pallet, staring at the gray light filtering through the hole in the roof, Clara knew she was going to die. Here, in this forgotten place, where no one would ever know or care. Her family had cast her out, and God had abandoned her. A strange sense of calm settled over her. The panic was gone, burned away by the fever. But then a flicker of defiance sparked in the embers of her spirit. She would not die lying down in this ruin. She would not let the silence of her family be the last word. If she was going to die, she would do it on her feet, looking for help, fighting until the very last second. With a monumental effort, she pushed herself up. The room spun violently. She wrapped her thin shawl tightly around her shoulders, pulled on her ruined boots, and stumbled out the door. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. The snow was almost up to her knees, and each step was a battle. She didn't know where she was going. There was no path, no sign of life, just the endless silent trees and the suffocating white. She pushed forward, driven by some primal instinct, her mind a swirl of feverish images, her mother's face, the scent of magnolias in their garden, the cold stars over the prairie. She didn't know how long she walked, 10 minutes or an hour. Time had lost its meaning. Her legs grew heavy, clumsy, her vision blurred. The white snow and the gray sky merging into one. She tripped on a hidden root, falling face first into the snow. The cold was a shock, then a strange, welcoming numbness. She tried to get up, but her limbs would not obey. The fight was over. The cold was wrapping her in its embrace, singing a soft, lulling song. Her last thought was of the injustice of it all. She closed her eyes and let the darkness take her. Elias Boone moved through the forest like a shadow. The snow did not crunch under his deerskin boots. It whispered. 5 years of solitude had stripped him of all unnecessary sound, all wasted motion. He was a part of the landscape now, as much as the pines and the granite cliffs. His beard was a wild, tangled thing, frosted with ice, and his eyes, deep set under a heavy brow, missed nothing. They saw the twitch of a rabbit's ear under a snow-laden bush, the faint track of a deer, the distant circling of a hawk. He was hunting, his long rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm. When he saw it, a splash of dark color against the pristine white. 100 yards off his trail. It was wrong. It didn't belong. His first instinct was suspicion, a cold knot tightening in his gut. People were trouble. People brought noise and greed and violence. He had come to these mountains to escape all that. He debated turning back, leaving whatever it was to the forest. It was not his concern. The wilderness had its own rules, and sentimentality was not one of them. He had learned that the hard way. But something held him, a flicker of movement. No, the shape was still. He raised a hand to shield his eyes. Squinting, it looked like a person, a heap of dark cloth in the snow. His hand tightened on his rifle. It could be a trap, a wounded outlaw, waiting for a fool to come close. Slowly, cautiously, he made his way toward it, his steps deliberate, his rifle ready. The closer he got, the more the shape resolved itself. It was a woman. She was lying face down, one arm flung out as if reaching for something. Her dress was dark wool, torn and inadequate for the cold. Her hair, a rich chestnut brown, was fanned out against the snow, dusted with white flakes. He circled her, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees for any sign of another person. Nothing, just the silent woods and the falling snow. He nudged her shoulder with the toe of his boot. No response. He knelt, his knee sinking into the deep powder, and rolled her over. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with a feverish flush high on her cheekbones. Her lips were blue. A dusting of freckles stood out across the bridge of her nose. She was young, too young to be out here alone. He pressed 2 gloved fingers against her neck. The pulse was there, a faint, thready flutter, as weak as a trapped bird's wing. He stood up, looking down at her, the internal war raging inside him. Leave her. She was already half dead. Getting involved would only bring trouble. Drag the outside world back into the sanctuary he had built. He had his own ghosts. He didn't need to take on anyone else's. And then the memory came, unbidden and sharp as it always was. 5 years ago, the smell of wood smoke and baking bread. His cabin, smaller than the one he had now, but filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. His wife, Sarah, her laughter like the sound of the creek in springtime. His son, Thomas, just 6 years old, with a gap-toothed grin and eyes the same color as his mother's. Elias had been checking his trap lines, a long circuit that took 2 days. He had been whistling on his way home, a fat rabbit slung over his shoulder, already thinking about the stew Sarah would make. The silence was the first warning. No smoke from the chimney, no sign of Thomas playing by the woodpile. A cold dread, colder than any winter, had seized him. He had dropped the rabbit and run. The door was broken in. The inside was chaos. Furniture overturned, their few precious things smashed or stolen. And on the floor, he had found them. They hadn't even used guns, just knives and fists. Outlaws passing through, taking what they wanted. He had been too late. He hadn't been there to protect them. The grief had been a physical thing, a beast that had ripped him apart from the inside out and left him a hollow shell of a man. He had buried them on the hill overlooking the creek. Then he had burned the cabin to the ground, erasing the memory of the horror. He had walked deeper into the mountains, away from every road, every trail, every sign of man. He had built a new cabin, strong and solitary, a fortress against the world and the pain. He had become a ghost, a legend in the town below. The mountain man, the beast, maybe even a murderer. He didn't care. The silence was his penance. Elias looked down at the unconscious woman in the snow. Her face was so pale, so fragile. He saw the ghost of his wife's smile, the echo of his son's trust. He could not save them. He had failed them. But this woman, she was not dead yet. With a deep guttural sigh that seemed to be torn from the very depths of his soul, he made a decision. He could not leave her. To leave her would be to fail again, to let the silence and the cold win another soul. He holstered his rifle on his back, bent down, and carefully slid his arms under her. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile bundle of bones and cloth. He lifted her easily, her head lolling back against his shoulder. Her breath was a faint, warm puff against his icy beard. He knew of the old, rotting cabin a mile east. He had seen the smoke from its chimney a few days ago and had cursed the fool who had come to die in it. Now he understood. He turned and began the slow, arduous trek back, carrying the woman through the deepening snow. He did not take her to his own cabin. That was a sacred place, a tomb. He would take her back to her own ruin, but he would not let it become her grave. He laid her gently on the crude pallet inside, the cold of the room a palpable thing, working with an efficiency born of long practice. He scraped together the embers of her last fire and, with his own flint and steel, brought it back to roaring life. The light and warmth pushed back the gloom. He found a bucket and filled it with clean snow, setting it near the fire to melt. He tended to her quietly, a ghost in the shadows. He used a corner of her shawl, dipped in the warm water, to wipe the snow from her face and gently clean the grime from her skin. He saw the blisters on her hands, the raw, red skin, and understood the desperate fight she had put up. He propped her head up and managed to get a few spoonfuls of water between her cracked lips. She moaned softly, but did not wake. He stayed for an hour, feeding the fire until the room was no longer dangerously cold. He checked her pulse again. It was still weak, but steady. He looked around the pathetic cabin, at the gaping holes and the meager, useless belongings. He knew she would likely die anyway, but he had done what he could. He had given her a chance. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, he slipped out the door as silently as he had come, melting back into the snow-covered forest, leaving no trace behind except for a roaring fire and a woman hovering between life and death. The first thing Clara became aware of was the warmth. It was a deep, penetrating heat that seeped into her bones, chasing away the profound, deathly chill that had settled there. The second was the smell of wood smoke, rich and pungent, a scent of life and safety. For a long moment, she lay still, her mind a sluggish, foggy landscape. She thought perhaps she was dead, and this was some strange, warm anteroom to the afterlife. But then came the pain, a dull ache in her chest with every breath, a sharp stinging in the palms of her hands, a throbbing behind her eyes. Pain was for the living. With a groan, she forced her eyes open. The light was dim, but the room was transformed. A robust, cheerful fire crackled in the hearth, its flames dancing and casting flickering shadows on the rough log walls. The gaping hole in the roof above her had been crudely covered with a thick layering of pine boughs, blocking the falling snow and the worst of the wind. A bucket of water, clear and free of ice, sat near the fire. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, a wave of dizziness making the cabin tilt and sway. Her head felt heavy, but the searing heat of the fever had broken. It was replaced by a profound weakness that made her limbs feel like they were filled with sand. Someone had been here. Her gaze swept the small, single room. There were no footprints other than her own, no sign of another person, yet the evidence was everywhere. The fire, the patched roof, the water, and something else. Lying on the rickety table was a skinned rabbit, its pink flesh clean and ready for the pot. Beside it lay a small, rough-spun cloth bag. With trembling hands, she reached for it. Inside were dried herbs, their earthy, medicinal scent rising to meet her. A shiver, entirely unrelated to the cold, traced its way down her spine. Who had found her? Who had brought her back from the edge of death only to vanish like a ghost? She thought of the man with the mule, but he had been eager to leave, his face a mask of indifference. No, this was someone else, someone who knew the woods. A sliver of fear pierced through her exhaustion. Was her rescuer a friend or a foe who had simply delayed her demise for his own purposes? But the quiet, efficient care she had received didn't feel menacing. It felt competent, anonymous. The immediate need for survival overrode her speculation. The rabbit was a gift she could not afford to waste. It took her the better part of an hour to move from her pallet to the fireplace, her body a clumsy, unwilling vessel. She managed to cut up the meat with a small knife from her trunk, her blistered hands protesting with every movement, boiling it in the pot with some of the herbs. She created a thin, weak broth that was nonetheless the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. The warm liquid slid down her throat, carrying with it a strength she desperately needed. For 2 days, she drifted in a haze of recovery. She drank the broth, slept, and stared into the fire, listening to the wind howl outside. The silence of the cabin was absolute. No one came. The mystery of her savior remained, a question mark hanging in the smoky air. As her strength slowly returned, so did her despair. The help had been a temporary reprieve, a miracle that would not be repeated. She was still alone, still woefully unprepared, and winter had only just begun. The task of staying alive was a mountain so high she could not see its peak. She began to work again, her movements slow and deliberate, conserving every ounce of energy. She reinforced the patch on the roof, her hands clumsy with the frozen branches. She tried to hunt, She fashioned a crude snare from some twine she found in her trunk, setting it near a game trail she thought she recognized. For 3 days, it remained empty. Her attempt to build a deadfall trap was a pathetic failure, the log refusing to balance properly. The wilderness, it seemed, did not yield its secrets easily. Her food supply dwindled to nothing. She was forced to dig for roots under the snow, her fingers growing numb in the icy soil. She boiled them, creating a bitter, starchy meal that filled her stomach but offered little comfort. Everything was overwhelming. The sheer, crushing weight of every task, the endless need for firewood, the constant battle against the cold, the gnawing, ever-present hunger, wore her down. Some nights, when the loneliness was a physical presence in the cabin, she would curl under her blankets and cry. The tears would come silently, freezing on her cheeks, a quiet, desperate admission of her own futility. She did not sob or wail. There was no one to hear. It was a grief too deep for sound. She wept for the life she had lost, for the family who had discarded her like a broken doll, and for the foolish, stubborn girl who was freezing to death at the edge of the world. From the dense shadows of the tree line, Elias watched. He had told himself he would not come back. He had given her a chance, and the rest was up to her and whatever god she prayed to. But he could not stay away. Each morning he found himself drawn back to the ridge overlooking her cabin, a silent, unseen sentinel. He watched her struggle, and a strange, unwelcome mix of emotions churned within him. He was impressed by her refusal to give up. She was a city girl, soft and useless by the standards of this land. Yet she fought. She swung the hatchet with a grim determination, her small frame straining with the effort. She set her pathetic traps and dug for roots with a tenacity that bordered on madness. She should have given up. She should have laid down and died, but she didn't. This resilience also disturbed him. It made her real. It chipped away at the wall of detachment he had so carefully constructed around his heart. Her fight reminded him of Sarah's, of the way she had fought the sickness that had taken her mother years ago, her spirit burning bright until the very end. This girl's struggle was a faint echo of that, and it stirred embers he thought had long gone cold. It made him feel things he did not want to feel: pity, anger, a grudging respect, and a dangerous, terrifying flicker of responsibility. He left another rabbit on her doorstep one morning before dawn, and a small sack of cornmeal. He told himself it was the last time, but it wasn't. One afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, ugly purple. The wind, which had been a constant whisper, rose to a mournful howl, rattling the very bones of the forest. Elias, hunkered down in his own sturdy, well-chinked cabin a few miles away, knew a bad storm was coming. He thought of the girl and the rotting shack with its makeshift patch of pine boughs. It would not hold. For Clara, the storm was the final enemy. It descended with a terrifying fury, unleashing a torrent of sleet and snow that beat against the cabin like 1,000 angry fists. The wind shrieked through the cracks in the walls, and the entire structure groaned and shuddered. For hours, her crude roof patch held, but then a single fat drop of icy water landed on her forehead. She looked up. Another fell, then another. A small leak became a steady drip, then a trickling stream. The water poured onto her blankets, onto the floor, hissing as it hit the edges of the fire. The cold, wet misery was more demoralizing than the hunger or the loneliness. The wilderness was washing her away. She abandoned her pallet. Dragging her soaked blankets to the driest corner of the cabin, she curled into a tight ball, shivering uncontrollably, the cold seeping into her marrow. This was it, the end. She had fought, but the mountain was stronger. She closed her eyes, a single, hot tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. And then she heard it, a sound that did not belong to the storm. Thump, thump, thump. It was a knocking, heavy and solid, at the door. Her heart leaped into her throat. Fear, stark and primal, washed over her. Who could possibly be out in this? Bandits? A madman? She held her breath, praying it was just the wind, a branch hitting the wood. Thump, thump, thump. It was insistent, real. She was too terrified to move, too weak to fight. Slowly, the leather hinge creaked as the door was pushed open. A massive figure filled the doorway, blocking out the swirling chaos of the storm. He was a giant of a man, broad-shouldered and wrapped in thick furs. A wild, dark beard covered the lower half of his face, and his eyes were shadowed under the brim of a low-slung hat. It was the face of the wilderness itself, harsh, unforgiving, and ancient. Clara scrambled back, pressing herself against the cold logs, a small cry catching in her throat. The man stepped inside, bringing a blast of wind and snow with him. He pushed the door shut, the sound unnervingly final. For a long moment, he just stood there, his gaze sweeping over the miserable scene, the leaking roof, the sputtering fire, and the terrified girl huddled in the corner. He was the one. She knew it instantly. This was her ghost, her secret benefactor. He pulled off his hat, revealing a tangle of dark hair. He did not speak. He simply moved to the fire, added several large logs from a pile he must have left outside her door, and skillfully coaxed it back to a healthy blaze. Then he turned his attention to the roof. He worked in an almost complete silence. His movements were economical and sure, devoid of any wasted effort. He retrieved a bundle of cured hides and tools from a pack he'd brought inside. With a low grunt, he gestured for her to move. Timidly, she obeyed, watching as he climbed onto the rickety table, his weight making it groan, and began to work on the ceiling. He worked for over an hour, securing the hides over the hole, his powerful hands driving wooden pegs into the rotting logs. The deluge slowed to a drip, and then stopped. He then turned to the walls, mixing mud with dry grass he'd brought and methodically chinking the worst of the cracks. They barely spoke. The only words exchanged were necessities. "Water," he rumbled, his voice a low, gravelly sound, unused to speech. Clara scrambled to hand him the bucket. "Hold this," he commanded, passing her a strip of hide. His presence was a strange and potent mixture of terror and comfort. He was a wild, untamed thing, and some deep, instinctual part of her was terrified of him. But his quiet, focused competence was an anchor in the storm. For the first time since arriving in this God-forsaken place, she was not alone in her fight. When he was finished, the cabin was transformed. It was still a ruin, but it was a dry, warm ruin. The wind no longer shrieked through the walls. It only moaned from a distance. He stood by the fire, warming his hands. Clara remained in her corner, watching him. She needed to say something, to thank him, but the words wouldn't form. "You'll die here," he said, not looking at her. It wasn't a question or a threat. It was a simple statement of fact. "I know," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He finally turned to look at her, his eyes a startlingly clear shade of gray. They were old eyes, filled with a sadness so profound it seemed to pull the light from the room. "Why are you here?" The question was not accusatory, but genuinely curious. The answer caught in her throat, a lump of shame and grief. She just shook her head, pulling her blanket tighter. He did not press her. He gave a short, curt nod, turned, and left, disappearing back into the storm as suddenly as he had appeared. Over the next few days, a new routine began. He would appear in the mornings, never knocking, just suddenly being there. He brought supplies, a sack of flour, salted pork, coffee, and he began to teach her. He didn't use many words. He was a teacher of action. He showed her how to properly set a snare, his large, calloused hands moving with surprising dexterity as he fashioned the loop and trigger. He took her old, rusted hatchet, and with a stone from the creek bed, sharpened it to a razor's edge. He pointed out which trees made the best firewood and which roots were safe to eat. Slowly, grudgingly, Clara felt she was earning a sliver of his respect. He watched as she mastered the snare, her initial clumsiness giving way to a focused patience. One morning, she caught a snowshoe hare. The pride she felt was a fierce, unfamiliar thing. She skinned and cleaned it herself, her stomach turning but her hands steady, following the motions he had shown her. When he arrived that day, he saw the pelt drying by the fire and gave one of his curt, almost imperceptible nods. For Clara, it felt like the highest praise. One evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a stew she had made from the hare, the quiet between them felt less tense than usual. The warmth of the fire and the food in her belly loosened something inside her, a knot of pain she had held tightly for months. "They sent me here to be forgotten," she said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. Elias looked up from the bowl he was cradling, his gray eyes unreadable in the firelight. He said nothing, but his stillness was an invitation. He was listening. The words started to spill out, a torrent of shame and misery. "My family, they said I was ruined, that I had brought dishonor to their name." She hugged her knees to her chest, unable to look at him. "There was a man, an important man. He wanted something from me, and I couldn't stop him. And when it was discovered, it was my fault. I was the one who was cast out." My mother didn't even say goodbye. The last words were choked by a sob she couldn't contain. "I am ruined, unwanted." She finally risked a glance at him, expecting to see disgust, or pity, or perhaps just the cold indifference she had grown so accustomed to. But his face was a stony mask. He just looked at her, his expression unchanging, and listened until her quiet sobs subsided. He offered no words of comfort, no judgment, no absolution. He just listened. When she was finished, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. Elias stood up, his large frame seeming to fill the entire space. For a moment, she thought he would leave, disgusted by her confession. Instead, he walked outside into the cold night. She heard the sharp, rhythmic ring of the axe striking wood. He began splitting firewood with a controlled, quiet fury, each blow a release of some powerful, contained emotion. He chopped until a massive pile lay neatly stacked by the door. Long after the need was met, it was his only reply. From that day on, something shifted. The work on the cabin became a shared project. He showed her how to mix a better daubing for the walls, how to brace the sagging doorframe. She, in turn, began to assert herself. She scrubbed the floors with sand and water until the wood shone. She swept the hearth and tidied her meager belonging, creating a small pocket of order in the chaos. One afternoon, as she was smoothing mud into a crack in the wall, her hands chapped and stained, she looked around the small, rough space. The fire was burning warmly. A pot of stew was simmering, and the walls no longer let in the wind. A strange feeling washed over her. It was not joy or even contentment, but a simple, profound sense of belonging. "I am home," she whispered to herself. And the word, spoken in this desolate place, startled her with its truth. This ruin, this grave her family had sent her to, was becoming her home. Miles away, in the deep solitude of his own cabin, Elias sat by his fire. The image of Clara's face, streaked with tears but defiant, was burned into his mind. Her confession of shame had not disgusted him. It had filled him with a cold, familiar rage, an anger at the cruelty of the world, at the powerful who preyed on the weak, at the injustice that had shattered his own life and had tried so hard to shatter hers. He picked up a piece of seasoned pine and his skinning knife. His hands, which could be so brutal and strong, moved with a surprising tenderness and precision. As the firelight danced on the walls, he began to carve. He did not think about it. He let his hands do the work, letting the memory and the emotion guide the blade, shaving by shaving. Cut by cut, a shape began to emerge from the wood. It was her face, not as it was when she cried, but as it was when she worked, her jaw set in determination, her eyes focused, her spirit refusing to break. A small wooden figure of the woman who would not die. The world thawed. It happened slowly at first. A single drop of water falling from an icicle, then a trickle of meltwater carving a dark path through the snow. The sun, a stranger for so long, gained a timid strength, and the iron grip of winter began to relax. The snow receded, leaving the earth dark and smelling of pine and damp soil. The creek, once a silent, frozen serpent, began to murmur and then to roar, its voice a celebration of its own release. Spring did not bring peace, only a different kind of struggle. The dangers of the wilderness did not hibernate. Clara, with Elias's help, had acquired a nanny goat from a trapper passing through, a creature with intelligent yellow eyes and a stubborn spirit. The goat, named Beatrice by Clara, in a moment of whimsy, was a promise of milk and cheese, a small step toward a life that was more than just survival. But one morning, Clara went to the lean-to they had built for the goat and found it empty. The door was smashed, and the snow outside was a churned, bloody mess of tracks. Wolves. Elias found the carcass later, a quarter-mile into the woods. Clara did not cry. She just stared at the blood on the snow, her jaw tight, another hard lesson settling into her bones. The wilderness gave, and the wilderness took away. A week later, another kind of predator passed by. 3 hard-faced men on weary horses, their rifles held easy across their saddles. They stopped at the creek to water their mounts, their voices carrying on the clear spring air. Clara and Elias watched from the thick cover of the woods, silent and still. Elias's hand rested on the stock of his rifle, his body a coiled spring of readiness. The men's laughter was harsh, their eyes constantly scanning the trees. They were looking for something, or someone. After a long, tense 10 minutes, they moved on, their presence a greasy stain on the clean air. Danger wore more than one face in these mountains. But there were moments of grace. Clara learned the names of the wildflowers that pushed their way through the last of the snow: Indian paintbrush, lupine, and the delicate, resilient spring beauty. She learned the taste of fresh trout, caught in the rushing creek and cooked over an open fire. She and Elias fell into a rhythm of work, a partnership built on shared tasks and long stretches of silence. The silence was different now. Less a chasm between them and more a comfortable space they inhabited together. He would chop wood while she tended the small garden patch she had painstakingly cleared. They would check the trap lines together, his long strides matched by her determined, quicker steps. It was on one of these excursions, searching for wild onions on a sun-dappled slope, that the world exploded in a roar of fury. A she-bear, massive and cinnamon-colored, erupted from a thicket of alder not 20 yards away. She had cubs, small, dark balls of fur that scrambled behind her. The bear rose to her full, terrifying height, her head swaying, her black lips pulled back from yellow teeth, the air filled with a sound that was pure, primal rage. Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. The hand trowel fell from her numb fingers. There was no time to think, no time to run. Elias moved. He was not a man anymore. He was a force of nature as swift and deadly as the bear. He shoved Clara behind him with one powerful arm. The command, "Down!" A guttural bark. He didn't have time to raise his rifle. As the bear charged, a blur of fur and claws, he drew the heavy skinning knife from his belt and met her head-on. The impact was brutal. Man and beast became a whirlwind of violence. Clara, huddled on the ground, could see flashes of Elias's buckskin shirt, the dark mass of the bear, and the glint of steel. The roaring of the bear was matched by a raw, inhuman cry from Elias, a sound of pure, desperate battle. He was trying to get under the raking claws, to find a vital spot with his knife. The bear's claws, long and curved as daggers, tore through the thick hide of his shirt. He was thrown back, landing hard on the rocky ground. The bear was on him in an instant, its massive head low, jaws snapping. Clara screamed, a thin, helpless sound lost in the chaos. But Elias was already moving, rolling, coming up on one knee. His shirt was in tatters, and blood welled from deep gouges across his chest and back. He ignored it. As the bear lunged again, he drove his knife upward, putting all his weight and strength into a single, desperate thrust into the soft underside of the animal's neck. The bear gave a choked, gargling roar. It staggered back, a fountain of dark blood pumping from the wound. It took 2 more steps, swiped a clawed paw weakly at the air, and then crashed to the ground, its great body twitching before falling still. Silence descended, heavy and absolute, broken only by the panicked chirping of a bird and the ragged, gasping breaths of Elias. He remained on one knee for a long moment, his head bowed, the bloody knife still clutched in his hand. Clara scrambled to his side. "Elias!" He looked up, his face pale under his beard. His eyes glazed with the shock of battle. "The cubs," he rasped. "Scare them off." Clara, her heart hammering against her ribs, did as she was told. She grabbed a fallen branch and ran toward the whimpering cubs, shouting and waving her arms. Terrified, they turned and fled into the safety of the deep woods. When she returned, Elias was trying to stand. He swayed on his feet, his face ashen. "It's nothing," he muttered, but the words were a lie. His shirt was soaked with blood, and the wounds on his chest were long, deep furrows. "Don't be a fool," Clara said, her voice sharp with a fear that was quickly turning into a fierce, protective anger. "Let me help you." She guided him back to the cabin, his arm slung over her shoulder, his heavy weight a comforting, terrifying reality. She eased him onto the stool by the fire and carefully, her hands trembling, began to peel away the ruined remnants of his shirt. And then she saw them. Beneath the fresh, bleeding wounds were the old ones. His chest and back were a roadmap of past battles, a story told in ruined flesh. A long, puckered scar ran from his shoulder down across his ribs. The work of a knife, another. A jagged, star-shaped mark on his side. Looked like it had come from a bullet. There were dozens of smaller scars, white and silver against his tanned skin, a testament to a life of violence and survival. She said nothing as she cleaned the new wounds with warm water and the last of the medicinal herbs. Her touch was gentle, her movements efficient. He sat rigid, his fists clenched on his knees, his breathing harsh. He did not flinch, but she could feel the tension radiating from him, a wall of pain he refused to acknowledge. When she was finished, she bandaged him with strips torn from one of her old chemises. The white cloth was a stark contrast to his weathered skin and the angry red of his injuries. They sat in silence for a long time, the fire crackling, the only sound in the room. Clara looked at the scars, the old and the new. They were not just marks on his skin. They were the doors to the locked rooms of his past, and she could no longer bear not knowing what was inside. "Who did this to you?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. She touched the edge of the long, puckered scar on his shoulder. "Not the bear, the others." Elias went still, his jaw tightened. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me," she said, her gaze unwavering. "You saved my life. You've taught me how to live. But you keep a part of yourself locked away, like a ghost. I want to know who I'm sharing my home with." He stood up abruptly, turning his back to her, and walked to the window. He stared out at the forest, his broad shoulders slumped in a way she had never seen before. "It's better you don't know." "Why?" she pressed, standing and moving to stand behind him. "Are you a wanted man? Elias, are you an outlaw?" He gave a harsh, bitter laugh. "No, nothing so simple." He turned from the window, his gray eyes shadowed with a grief so immense it seemed to suck the air from the room. "I had a family once," he said, the words rough, as if torn from his throat. "A wife, Sarah. and a son, Thomas. He spoke their names as if they were fragile things he was afraid of breaking. We had a cabin down in the valley. It was a good life. Simple. He paused, swallowing hard. I was away, checking my traps. Gone 2 days. When I came back, his voice broke. He stopped, his composure crumbling. Outlaws. They passed through, took what they wanted. They were not kind. He looked at Clara, and in his eyes, she saw the full, unvarnished horror of what he had found. By the time I found them, he whispered. It was too late. They were gone, both of them. The story settled in the space between them, a weight of unimaginable sorrow. The scars on his body were nothing compared to this. This was the wound from which all the others had grown. This was the beast that had driven him into the silence of the mountains. Clara felt a profound ache in her own chest, an echo of his pain. She understood now. The silence, the solitude, the fury she had seen when he chopped the wood after her own confession. It was all born from this. Slowly, she reached out and laid her hand on his forearm. His skin was warm, his muscles tense as stone beneath her touch. He flinched but did not pull away. You still carry them, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He did pull away then, a sharp, reflexive movement, as if her touch and her understanding were a brand. He took a step back, his face a mask of anguish. But he did not leave the cabin. He just stood there, a wounded giant trapped by the ghosts she had finally seen. The next days were quiet and strained. Elias's wounds began to heal, but the one she had opened in his heart remained raw and exposed. He was more distant than ever, the comfortable silence replaced by a tense, heavy one. He started sleeping in the small, dilapidated shed they had repaired for the goat, creating a physical distance that mirrored the emotional one. One evening, they were working together to finish a more permanent patch on the roof, replacing the hides with carefully split cedar shakes. They worked until dusk, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. As the last shake was nailed into place, a sudden wind blew in, cold and smelling of rain. The sky, which had been clear moments before, was now a roiling mass of dark clouds. The first drops of rain began to fall as they climbed down the ladder, fat and heavy, kicking up dust on the dry ground. Within minutes, it was a downpour, a hard, driving rain that sluiced down in sheets. Clara ran inside, but Elias turned toward the shed. "Elias, wait!" she called out over the roar of the rain. He stopped, his back to her. "Don't be foolish. You'll catch your death of a chill. Come inside." He hesitated. The shed was 100 feet away. A world away. To come inside the cabin for the night was to cross a line he had drawn for himself. "Please," she said, her voice softer now, almost lost in the storm. After a long moment, he turned and walked slowly, deliberately, into the cabin. He closed the door behind him, shutting out the storm and sealing them inside together. The space, which had felt like a home, suddenly felt small and charged with an unspoken tension. Clara busied herself with the fire, adding logs, acutely aware of his presence behind her. He stood dripping by the door, a silent, brooding figure. She laid out the furs and blankets on her pallet, the only bed in the cabin. "You can take the bed," she said, not looking at him. "I can sleep by the fire." "No," he said, his voice low. "It's your home." "There's enough room for two," she countered, her voice trembling slightly. It was a bold, terrifying offer. He did not answer. He shed his wet outer coat and hung it on a peg. In the dim firelight, she could see the white of the bandages through his now damp shirt. He walked to the pallet and sat on the edge, his back to her. After a moment, Clara lay down on the other side, keeping a careful distance between them. The furs were warm, smelling of pine smoke and of him. The sound of the rain on the new roof was a steady, drumming rhythm, a counterpoint to the frantic beating of her own heart. She could feel the warmth of his body, could hear his quiet, controlled breathing. Her own body began to tremble, a fine, uncontrollable shudder. It was not from fear. It was from the weight of all the lonely nights, of being untouched, unwanted, unseen. It was the trembling of a soul that had been starved for a simple, human warmth. He must have felt it, because the quality of his stillness changed. He was listening, sensing her vulnerability. She had to speak. She had to make him understand. "I'm not asking for forever," she whispered to the shadows, her voice so quiet she wasn't sure he could hear it over the rain. "I'm not asking for anything you can't give." She took a shaky breath. "Just don't look at me like they did, like I'm something broken, something ruined." He was silent for a long time. She thought perhaps he hadn't heard her, or that he would say nothing. But then, slowly, he turned toward her. In the flickering firelight, his face was a landscape of shadow and sorrow. His gray eyes held a deep, aching tenderness she had never seen before. He reached out a hand, not to touch her, but as if to feel the air between them. Then, with an infinite slowness, he leaned in, and he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of acceptance. It was gentle, hesitant, and profoundly sad. It tasted of rain and wood smoke and loneliness. It was a quiet acknowledgement of all the pain they both carried. Clara felt the tears she had held back for so long finally break free, sliding silently from the corners of her eyes. The night that followed was tender and intense. It was not perfect. It was clumsy and honest. A quiet exploration of two broken people finding solace in one another. It was a sharing of warmth against the cold. A silent promise that for this one night, in the heart of the storm, they were not alone. Both of them woke in the gray light of dawn shaken, irrevocably changed. Clara woke first. The pallet beside her was empty and cold. The cabin was silent, the rain having stopped. Elias was gone. A familiar, aching loneliness washed over her, sharper and more painful than ever before. She sat up, pulling a fur blanket around her shoulders, and her eyes fell upon the hearth. Sitting on the rough stone, catching the first rays of morning sun, was a small, wooden carving. It was the figure of a woman, her jaw set in determination, her eyes focused, her spirit refusing to break. It was her face. The anger came after the ache. For the first few hours of that cold, clear morning, Clara was adrift in a sea of familiar loneliness. He was gone. The warmth of him on the pallet, the weight of his presence in the cabin, it had all vanished with the dawn, leaving behind only a deeper, sharper cold. She sat with the fur blanket wrapped around her. Her world shrunk to the four rough walls of the cabin, the silence a deafening roar. Then she saw the carving on the hearth. She picked it up, her calloused fingers tracing the lines of the face he had whittled from wood. It was her, but not the broken, shamed girl who had arrived in these mountains. This was a woman with strength in her jaw and a fire in her eyes. He saw that in her. He had seen it, and he had touched it, and he had shared his own brokenness with her. And then he had left. That was when the anger came. It was a clean, hot fire that burned away the fog of her sorrow. It was not the impotent rage of a victim. It was the fury of a woman who had been given a glimpse of something real, only to have it snatched away. And in the heart of that fire, an awful, undeniable truth crystallized. She was angry because she loved him. The realization was a punch to the gut. Love was a thing of novels and drawing rooms, a foolish, dangerous emotion that had no place in this world of rock and snow and survival. Love was a vulnerability she could not afford, a weakness that would surely get her killed. And yet, there it was, a stubborn, resilient thing growing in the barren soil of her heart. She was angry because his leaving felt like a betrayal not of a single night, but of a future she hadn't even dared to imagine. She did not weep. She worked. Her anger demanded an outlet, and she poured it into the land, into the cabin. She would not let this place remain a monument to her exile and his abandonment. If he would not stay, she would make a home so strong, so vibrant, that his absence would be a ghost haunting his own memory, not hers. This would be her way of calling him back, not with pleas, but with proof that she was not something to be saved and then discarded. She was a woman who could build. She found the rusted head of a spade near the creek and fashioned a new handle for it. She spent days turning over the hard, rocky soil in front of the cabin, her muscles screaming in protest, her hands bleeding. She cleared a patch of earth and, using the seeds she had carefully saved from the supplies he had brought, she planted a garden, rows of beans, squash, and corn. It was a desperate, hopeful act. She found a deposit of colored clay by the water and mixed it with goat tallow and ash. With this crude paint, she painted shutters she built for the window, a cheerful, earthy red that stood in defiant contrast to the gray, weathered logs. She swept the earth in front of the cabin until it was smooth and hard-packed. She found wild columbine and Indian paintbrush blooming in the high meadows and carefully transplanted them to the edge of her garden. She was not just surviving anymore. She was creating. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was an extension of her own stubborn will. Deep in the mountains, in a place so remote even the wolves trod lightly, Elias battled a different kind of wilderness. He had fled Clara's warmth as a man flees a house on fire. To be near her, to feel her trust and her touch, was to feel the thawing of a part of himself he had long considered dead and buried. And the thawing was an agony. With it came the ghosts. They were with him constantly now, more vivid than they had been in years. He would be tracking an elk and suddenly see Sarah's smile. Her head tilted just so as she listened to a story he was telling. He would hear the rush of the wind through the pines and think it was Thomas's laughter, a sound that now felt like a physical blow to his chest. They did not speak, his ghosts. They simply watched him with their sad, knowing eyes. He saw their faces in the fire, in the reflection of a still mountain lake, and their presence was a constant, silent accusation. You failed us. You were not here. How dare you find warmth in another's arms when ours went cold? Survivor's guilt was a poison he had been drinking for 5 years. He had accepted his penance of solitude, his life sentence of loneliness. It was his due. Clara was a complication he could not afford. She was light and warmth and a fierce, stubborn life force, and he felt like a desecration just being near her. He believed, with the certainty of a zealot, that he was a magnet for death. Violence and loss clung to him like a shroud. He had brought it to his first family, and he would surely bring it to her. Leaving her was the only decent thing he had ever done. It was an act of love, twisted and painful as it was. So he hunted, and he walked, and he tried to outrun the memory of her, but her face and the feel of her trembling in his arms was a ghost more persistent than any other. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a circuit rider, a thin, weathered man named Josiah, who traveled the remote homesteads once every few months with news and mail. He looked at Clara with a mixture of pity and curiosity, his eyes taking in the painted shutters and the neat garden. The envelope was crisp and white, addressed in a perfect, elegant script that felt alien in her calloused hands. There was no return address, but she knew. A cold dread washed over her as she broke the wax seal. The letter was not from Mr. Abernathy himself, but from his lawyer. The language was polite, formal, and utterly chilling. It spoke of Mr. Abernathy's concern for her welfare, his desire to ensure she was settled comfortably. It mentioned that he had recently acquired some business interests in the Montana Territory and would be traveling in the region. It closed with a veiled warning, a single sentence that made the blood freeze in her veins. Mr. Abernathy is a man who values his reputation above all things and takes great care to see that loose ends are tied and past accounts are settled. It was a threat. He was coming. He had not forgotten her. He had cast her out, ruined her life, and now he was coming to ensure her silence was permanent. The rumors Josiah the rider had heard in the settlement down below confirmed it. Whispers of a disgraced woman from St. Louis, a fallen dove hiding in the mountains. Her past was not a distant memory. It was a hungry wolf, and it had caught her scent. Elias had not gone far. He told himself he was respecting her space, giving her the solitude she deserved. But he was a liar. He was a moth circling a flame, unable to fly into the fire but incapable of flying away. From a high wooded ridge, he could just make out the patch of red on her window shutters, a small, brave spot of color in the vast green and gray of the mountains. He watched her work, her small figure moving with a purpose that both warmed and broke his heart. He went into the settlement for salt and ammunition, but his real purpose was to listen. The saloon was the town's beating heart, and its gossip was the blood that flowed through it. He sat in a dark corner, a ghost in plain sight, nursing a single whiskey, his ears open. He heard her story, twisted and ugly, passed between a group of prospectors. "Some rich man's fancy piece," one of them slurred. A man with a greasy beard and mean little eyes. "Send her up here to get her out of the way. I hear she's all alone up on that old Finch place. A man could get lonely up in these hills." The others laughed. A coarse, ugly sound. Elias's hand tightened around his glass, the urge to violence a hot, coiling serpent in his gut. He did nothing. A fight in here would only draw more attention to her. But the greasy prospector, whose name was Jeb, was persistent. He drank more. His talk grew louder, bolder. He was going to pay the lonely lady a visit. He boasted, see if she was welcoming to a hard-working man. Elias paid for his drink and left, melting into the twilight. He didn't go back to the mountains. He waited in the shadows at the edge of town, near the trail that led up to Clara's cabin. An hour later, Jeb stumbled out of the saloon, a bottle in his hand, and started the trek up the mountain. Elias let him get a half-mile from town. Where the trail was dark and the pines grew thick, he moved without a sound, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. Jeb never heard him. One moment he was whistling a tuneless, drunken song. The next a hand like an iron clamp seized the back of his neck, and he was slammed face first into the trunk of a pine tree. The world exploded in a flash of pain and stars. Before Jeb could even cry out, he was spun around. The mountain man was a terrifying silhouette against the moon. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His eyes burned with a cold, lethal fury. He drove a fist into Jeb's stomach, doubling him over with a gasp. As the man fell to his knees, Elias leaned in close, his voice a low, deadly whisper. "She is not for you. You will not go up this trail. You will not speak her name again. If I ever see you or hear of you within 5 miles of her land, I will finish this." He punctuated the last word with a sharp, brutal blow to the side of Jeb's head. The prospector collapsed into a heap on the ground, unconscious. Elias looked down at him for a moment, his chest heaving, the violence in him slowly receding, leaving a cold, familiar emptiness. He turned and disappeared back into the woods, leaving the drunk to wake up with a new and profound fear of the mountains. Clara saw him 3 days later. A storm was rolling in, the sky a bruised purple, the air thick and heavy. She was rushing to bring in the firewood she had chopped when she saw him standing at the edge of the clearing, as still as a granite boulder. Her heart leaped into her throat. All the anger, all the pain, all the longing of the past weeks coalesced into a single, sharp point. She dropped the wood she was carrying, the logs thudding to the ground. She marched toward him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "You came back." "I never left," he rumbled, his gray eyes searching her face. "You left me?" she cried, stopping a few feet from him. "You stayed for a night. You made me believe. You made me believe I was worth something more than a ruined girl to be hidden away. And then you vanished. Was I a charity case? Elias, was I a stray animal you could feed and then abandon when you grew tired of it? The pain in his face was stark and real. Clara, no! Then why? She demanded, tears of anger and hurt blurring her vision. Why would you do that? You were worth everything, he said, the words torn from him, raw and bleeding. That's why I left. She stared at him, bewildered. That makes no sense. It's the only thing that does, he said, his voice ragged with an anguish that mirrored her own. Everything I touch, I destroy. I bring death. Clara, I brought it to my wife and my son. I could not, I will not bring it to you. The first drops of rain began to fall, cold and heavy, plastering her hair to her cheeks. So you would leave me here to face it alone? To protect me? My past is coming for me. Elias, a man who tried to destroy me once, is on his way here to finish the job. And the wolves are circling. Is that your idea of safety? To leave me defenseless? The rain was coming down harder now, sluicing over them. But neither moved. They were caught in a storm of their own making. I have been watching, he admitted. I would not let them harm you. I don't want a ghost in the trees. Elias, she shouted over the rising wind. I don't want a protector who hides in the shadows. I want a man who will stand with me in the light. You talk about safety, but living in fear is not safe. Living alone is not safe. This half-life you've chosen for yourself, this silence, it's not living. It's just a long, slow death. She took a step closer, jabbing a finger at his chest. I am not your wife. I am not your son. I am not another ghost for you to mourn. I am alive, and I am fighting, and I will not let you use your pain as an excuse to run away from me. She was crying openly now, the rain mingling with her tears. If you can't fight for us, then leave me to the wolves. Go back to your ghosts. But don't you dare stand there and lie to me and say you don't care. Her words struck him down. All his justifications, all his carefully constructed reasons, crumbled to dust. She was right. He had been a coward, hiding behind his grief. He reached for her, his hands gripping her upper arms. I care, he said, his voice thick and broken. God help me. Clara, it's the only thing I'm sure of anymore. And then he kissed her. It was nothing like the first time. There was no tenderness, no sadness. This was a kiss of desperation, of surrender. It was hard, and bruising, and raw with all the pain and longing they had both held inside. It was the desperate clash of two people who had been alone for too long. A drowning man clinging to his only hope of rescue. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and anger, and a love that was as wild and untamed as the mountains around them. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathless, the storm raging around them. He looked down at her, his gray eyes clear and fierce, stripped of all their ghosts. He didn't leave. He did not leave. Those 3 words changed the world. The cabin was no longer a place of solitude, but of companionship. The silence was no longer empty, but filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. The ghosts of the past did not vanish, but they receded, their sorrowful whispers muffled by the steady, living presence of another soul. Their life together found a new rhythm, one built not just on survival, but on the quiet, steady work of building a future. The days grew longer, warmer. Elias, who had only ever taught Clara the grim necessities of staying alive, began to teach her how to truly live in these mountains. The most important lesson was the rifle. He brought out his spare one, a heavy, long-barreled Hawken. You need to know, he said, his voice flat, but his eyes serious. You can't always count on me being here. The weight of the rifle was immense, a solid, deadly thing in her arms. At first, she flinched from it. The cold steel a reminder of the violence that was coming for them, the violence that had shattered his life. The first time she fired it, the recoil slammed the butt of the stock into her shoulder, a brutal, jarring kick that knocked the breath from her lungs and sent the shot wide into the trees. She stumbled back, her ears ringing. her shoulder throbbing. Elias said nothing. He simply took the rifle, reloaded it with a calm efficiency, and handed it back to her. Again, he said, "Plant your feet. Lean into it. Don't fight it. Become part of it." Day after day, they practiced. He was a patient, exacting teacher. He showed her how to measure the powder, how to ram the ball home, how to breathe out slow and steady before squeezing the trigger. He corrected her stance, his large hand resting briefly on her back to steady her. His touch was practical, instructive, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the sun. Slowly, she improved. The flinch disappeared, replaced by a focused stillness. Her shots grew truer. And, one afternoon, she hit the tin can he had set on a stump 50 yards away, sending it spinning into the air with a satisfying ping. A slow, rare smile touched Elias's lips, a sight so unexpected it made her heart skip a beat. And as he taught her the grim business of shooting, she, in turn, began to teach him how to laugh again. It was not a deliberate act, but a natural consequence of her presence. She had a dry, quiet wit, a resilience that refused to be bowed by circumstance. One evening, she told him about the stuffy, formal dinners of her past in St. Louis, mimicking the high-pitched, gossiping voice of a society matron. Elias watched her, his expression unreadable at first, and then a low chuckle rumbled deep in his chest. The sound was rusty, unused, but it was real. It was the sound of a frozen spring beginning to thaw. Another time, while chasing a chicken that had escaped its coop, she tripped over a root and landed in a heap in the mud. She looked up at him, her face and dress splattered, and instead of frustration, she burst into a fit of helpless laughter. After a moment's hesitation, he joined her, his deep laugh echoing through the clearing, a sound of pure, unadulterated life. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet majesty of the mountains, they were not two broken people hiding from the world. They were just a man and a woman, laughing in the mud. The cabin transformed with them. It was no longer a rotting shell, but a living, breathing home. The garden flourished under Clara's care, its neat rows a testament to her persistence. Elias built a sturdy new door, a new table, and a set of shelves where Clara arranged the few books she owned alongside interesting rocks and feathers she found in the woods. The red shutters glowed in the evening sun. The place had a soul now, one they had built together. News of the change on the old Finch place trickled down the mountain. Josiah, the circuit rider, would stop by, his visits lasting longer each time. He'd share a cup of coffee and leave with a new story to tell. Trappers and prospectors, passing by on the main trail, would see the smoke from the chimney, the splash of color from the shutters, and the two figures working side by side. The whispers in the settlement changed. The mountain man, the ghost of the high peaks, had been seen, and he was not alone. The story of the fallen woman from the east became the story of the woman who had tamed the beast of the mountains. The need for nails, strong and sharp, was what finally drove Elias back to town. They were building a new, larger lean-to for the animals, a project that required more than wooden pegs and hope. He did not want to go. The town was a place of bad memories and worse whiskey, but the need was real. He left at dawn, promising to be back by nightfall. The saloon was his last stop. After the general store and the blacksmith, he needed to hear the whispers, to gauge the temperature of the world below. He took his usual spot in the corner, the shadows his only companion. The talk was of a cattle drive, of a gold strike far to the south, and then, inevitably, it turned to them. "Heard Boone's got himself a woman up there," a man with a pock-marked face said, his voice loud enough to carry, "The fancy piece from St. Louis." "Some men have all the luck," another man slurred. The same greasy prospector Elias had confronted on the trail weeks ago. Jeb was back, his face still bearing a faint bruise on his cheekbone. his fear apparently washed away by cheap whiskey. "Though I hear she ain't picky. Thrown out of her own home for spreading her legs for a married man. Damaged goods is what she is." A wave of cold, white-hot rage washed over Elias. He gripped his empty glass, his knuckles white. He could feel the eyes of the other men on Jeb, some laughing, some just listening. Jeb, emboldened by his audience, leaned forward on the bar. "A man has to wonder what she's doing to keep a wild man like Boone fed and happy. Must be good at it, to keep him from killing her." That was the line. The quiet, contained fury inside Elias broke its leash. He moved with a speed that was terrifying in its silence. Before anyone could react, he had crossed the room. He didn't say a word. He grabbed Jeb by the front of his filthy shirt, lifted him clear off his stool, and smashed his fist into the man's face. There was a sickening crunch as bone and cartilage gave way. Jeb crumpled to the floor, blood pouring from his nose. The saloon went dead silent. The other men stared, their drunken grins frozen on their faces. Elias stood over the unconscious man, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a lethal fire. He slowly turned his gaze on the pockmarked man who had started the talk. The man shrank back, his face pale, and suddenly found the floor intensely interesting. "Her name," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous, each word a chip of ice, "is Clara. You will not speak it again." He turned and strode out of the saloon, leaving a stunned silence and a bleeding man on the floor. He was halfway to his horse when a voice called his name. "Boone, hold up!" It was Sheriff Miller, a man with a tired face and a drooping mustache. He walked with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who had seen too much trouble. "That was a fool thing to do," the sheriff said, stopping a few feet away. "You can't solve your problems by breaking noses, no matter how much the man deserves it." "He was talking about Clara," Elias grunted, his fists still clenched. "I know what he was talking about," the sheriff said, his voice weary. "The whole town knows. That's the problem. And it's about to get a lot worse." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I got a telegraph this morning. A man named Abernathy is coming. He's on the stage from Helena, due in 2 days. He's coming with 2 hired men and a lawyer from back east. He's telling everyone he's here to reclaim his stolen property." Elias went cold. "She's not his property." "Tell that to him and his lawyer," the sheriff said. "Look, Boone, I know you're not a bad man. Just a man who's had bad things happen to him. And I can see that woman has been good for you. So I'm telling you this as a man, not as the law. Take her and run. Disappear deeper into those mountains where even God can't find you. This Abernathy has money and power. He's come here looking for what he calls revenge for his lost reputation. Men like that, they don't fight fair. They buy the law, or they break it. There's no winning against a man like that." The ride back to the cabin was a blur of grim determination. The sheriff's words echoed in his head. Take her and run! It was the coward's way out. It was the way he had been living for 5 years. But Clara had taught him to stand, not to run. He found her in the garden, humming softly as she weeded. She looked up when she heard his horse, her face breaking into a smile that faltered when she saw his expression. He told her everything, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, laying out the facts as starkly as he could. He told her about the saloon, about the sheriff's warning, about Abernathy. She listened without interrupting, her hands still resting in the dark soil of her garden. When he was finished, she looked out at the mountains, at the home they had built. Her face was calm, her jaw set. "We are not running," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement. "Clara, he has lawyers, he has guns." "And we have this," she said, her voice quiet but fierce. She patted the earth with her hand. "We have this life we have made. He took my past, he took my family, he took my name and dragged it through the mud. I will not let him take this." She stood up and faced him, her eyes blazing. "He took everything once, not again." That night, as they sat by the fire. The weight of the coming storm settled over them. Elias watched her, saw the fear she was trying so hard to hide beneath her bravery. The sheriff's words came back to him. The law. A world of paper and judges that he didn't understand. But he knew it was a weapon, and Abernathy was bringing it to their door. There might be a way, he said slowly, the idea feeling foreign and strange on his tongue. To protect you, to protect this land. She looked at him, her expression questioning. Marry me, he said. The words came out blunt, practical. If you are my wife, this land is yours as much as mine. Your word. A wife's word might carry more weight in a court than a single woman's. It would give you a legal standing. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes before she masked it. She stood up and walked to the window, her back to him. The proposal, born of a desperate need to protect her, had sounded like a business transaction. It had sounded like the world she had fled, where women were bartered and married off for advantage and protection. No, she said, her voice small but firm. I will not do it. Clara, it's the smart thing to do. I am tired of doing the smart thing, she cried, whirling to face him, her pride a raw, open wound. I am tired of being a problem to be managed. I will not marry you to become a piece of property with a better legal claim than the one he thinks he has. I will not hide behind your name as a shield. The silence that followed was thick with her pain and his clumsy regret. He had offered her the only protection he could think of, and he had wounded her in the process. He did not press the issue. They went to bed in a strained quiet, the space between them once again a chasm. But in the middle of the night, she turned to him in the darkness. Elias, she whispered. I'm here. I will marry you, she said, her voice soft but clear. He could feel her trembling. I will marry you, not for protection, and not for the law, not because I am afraid. I will marry you because I love you, because in this whole, wide, cruel world, you are the only one who has ever seen me. I choose you. Elias Boone. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, a lifetime of unspoken sorrow and gratitude caught in his throat. They married the next day, in the quiet of the late afternoon. There was no preacher, no witnesses save for the ancient pines and the sun filtering through the new aspen leaves. They stood in a small clearing by the creek, the place where she had once cried in silent despair. Now, it was their cathedral. He wore a clean buckskin shirt, and she wore her best dress, a simple blue calico she had mended a dozen times. She had woven a wreath of wildflowers for her hair. He took her hands in his. They were small and calloused, but they fit perfectly in his own. I don't have pretty words. Clara, he began, his voice rough with emotion. I don't have a ring. All I have is what you see, a broken man in a wild place. But I swear this, I will stand with you. I will fight for you. I will honor you until my last breath. You are my home now. Tears streamed down her face as she looked up at him. And you are mine, she whispered. I thought I was sent here to die, but you taught me how to live. I swear to share my strength with you when you are weak, and my warmth when you are cold. I will stand by your side, come what may. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, gentle kiss that sealed their vows. And in the eyes of the mountains and the sky, they were husband and wife. That night, beneath the stars and the firs in their cabin, they made love. It was not an act of passion or a forgetting. It was a sacrament. It was a quiet, solemn sharing of all the pieces of themselves they had kept hidden. Every touch was a promise, every caress an acceptance of the scars, seen and unseen. They were not two people trying to erase their pain, but two souls brave enough to finally share it, to bear its weight together, and in doing so, to make it lighter. They came on a morning so beautiful it felt like a betrayal. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, and the sun, finally victorious over winter, spilled a honeyed gold across the valley. Clara was kneeling in her garden, her hands deep in the rich soil, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. Elias was splitting logs by the cabin, the rhythmic thud of his axe a steady, reassuring heartbeat. There was a peace between them, a quiet contentment that had been hard-won. And then, the peace was shattered. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their presence an immediate violation of the quiet clearing. The man in the lead was dressed in a fine, dark city suit, his posture rigid, his face pale with a rage that had curdled into something cold and reptilian. It was Mr. Abernathy. The men flanking him were of a different sort, their faces hard and empty, their hands resting on the butts of the pistols holstered at their hips. They rode directly to the cabin, their horses trampling a corner of Clara's garden. Elias lowered his axe, his body going unnaturally still, every line of him radiating a dangerous calm. Clara rose slowly from the ground, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Abernathy dismounted, his expensive boots sinking into the soft earth. He did not look at Elias. He fixed his gaze on Clara, a cruel, proprietary smile twisting his lips. He held up a piece of paper. "The law has a long arm, my dear," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, a sound that made Clara's skin crawl. "This is a court order, legally transferring this worthless plot of land back to your family's estate, to be administered by myself as repayment for the items you stole upon your departure." "I stole nothing," Clara said, her voice quiet but clear. Abernathy laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. "Of course not. And I suppose you are not the conniving little liar who spread such vicious rumors about me, the little harlot who nearly ruined my good name." He took a step closer, his eyes raking over her, stripping away her strength, trying to turn her back into the terrified girl he had known. "Did you really think you could hide from me out here? Did you think I would let you get away with it?" Elias moved then, stepping between them, his large frame a solid wall. "That's far enough," he said, his voice a low growl. Abernathy finally acknowledged him, looking him up and down with open contempt. "And who is this? The beast you've shacked up with? I should have known you'd find your level in the dirt with an animal." "She is my wife," Elias stated, the words like stones. Abernathy's face contorted in a mask of theatrical disbelief. "Your wife? Even better. This will make my acquisition of this property that much simpler when he is hanged for murder." He gestured to his hired guns. "Take him." Elias didn't let him finish. He didn't wait for the men to draw their guns. He moved with the explosive, lethal speed of a cornered wolf. The nearest gunman was reaching for his pistol when Elias's fist smashed into his throat, crushing his windpipe. The man gave a choked, gargling cry and fell from his saddle. The second gunman managed to clear his holster, but he was too slow. Elias already had his skinning knife out, the blade a flash of silver in the morning sun. He lunged forward, under the man's arm, and drove the knife upward. A single, brutal, efficient motion. The gunman's eyes went wide with shock, his pistol discharging into the empty sky as he slid to the ground. Abernathy screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror. He scrambled back, tripping over his own feet, his fine suit covered in mud. The first gunman, the one Elias had only struck, was staggering to his feet, pulling a knife of his own. He was the one who had fled. The other lay still. Elias turned to face him, his face a grim mask, his knife dripping red. But before he could take a step, another rider burst into the clearing. It was Sheriff Miller, his gun drawn. "Drop the knife, Boone!" the sheriff yelled, his face a mixture of resignation and regret. "It's over." The arrest was a blur of nightmarish moments. Elias, his hands bound, being led away without a backward glance. Abernathy, sputtering and venomous, telling the sheriff a twisted story of being ambushed, the body of the dead man being slung over his horse, and Clara, standing alone in the sudden, terrible silence, the scent of blood and gunpowder hanging in the beautiful morning air. The trial was held 2 days later in the town's main hall, a large, drafty room that served as a courthouse, a church, and a dance hall. It was packed. The entire town seemed to be there, their faces a sea of hostile curiosity. They looked at her not as a woman who had been wronged, but as a spectacle. The mountain man's woman, a piece of trouble that had finally boiled over. Elias sat beside his court-appointed lawyer, a young, nervous man who looked barely old enough to shave. Elias was in chains, his face impassive, but Clara could see the torment in his eyes, the agony of being caged. Mr. Abernathy was the picture of a grieving, wronged gentleman. His lawyer, a silver-tongued man from the East, painted a masterful picture for the judge, a stern, white-haired man named Harrison, who looked at Clara as if she were a piece of filth that had been tracked into his courtroom. The lawyer told the story Abernathy had crafted, a tale of a kind benefactor trying to reclaim a wayward, ungrateful girl, only to be met with savage, unprovoked violence. He called Elias a murderer, a wild animal who needed to be put down. He called Clara a thief, a liar, and a woman of low character, her testimony utterly worthless. The crowd murmured its agreement. They jeered when Clara's name was mentioned. When it was her turn to take the stand, a hush fell over the room. She walked past the rows of leering, judgmental faces, her head held high, and sat in the witness chair. She could feel Abernathy's smug gaze on her, confident in his victory. The young lawyer asked his questions, his voice trembling slightly, but Clara answered them clearly. She told the court how Abernathy and his men had arrived, how he had threatened her, how he had insulted her. Abernathy's lawyer rose to cross-examine her. He was a shark, circling his prey. Mrs. Boone, he began, the name dripping with sarcasm. Is it not true that you were expelled from your family home in St. Louis for indecent and immoral behavior? That is what my family chose to call it, Clara said, her voice steady. And is it not true that you took up with Mr. Abernathy, a respected married man, and when he tired of your affections, you attempted to blackmail him with vicious lies? That is not true, the lawyer laughed. Of course not. Let me ask you this. Why should this court believe the word of a woman like you? A woman cast out by her own family, a woman who lives in sin with a known killer in the wilderness. What kind of woman are you? The question hung in the air, a final, damning indictment. This was the moment to crumble, to weep, to prove them all right. Clara looked at Elias, at his chained hands and his proud, unbroken spirit. She looked at Abernathy, at his cruel, confident smile, and she looked at the judge, at his cold, dismissive eyes, and she found a strength she never knew she possessed. I will tell you what kind of woman I am, she said, her voice ringing with a newfound clarity that silenced the murmurs. She turned her gaze from the lawyer and spoke directly to the judge. I was born into a world of wealth and privilege. Your Honor, a world of fine houses and polite society, where a woman's worth is measured by her silence and her obedience. I was taught that a good reputation was more valuable than the truth. She paused, taking a deep breath, the words she had held inside for so long finally breaking free. That man, she said, pointing a steady finger at Mr. Abernathy, was a trusted friend of my father. He was a guest in our home, and one night he used that trust. He found me alone, and he took from me what was not his to take. It was not an act of affection. It was an act of violence, of power. And when I tried to speak of it, I was the one who was punished. A shocked silence fell over the courtroom. Abernathy's face had gone pale. My father, to protect his own name and his friendship with that man, declared that I was ruined. My mother said nothing. They put me on a wagon and sent me here with a deed to a rotting cabin, expecting me to die. They sent me away like trash, to be forgotten, because the truth was less important than a man's reputation. She stood up from the witness chair, her small frame radiating an undeniable power. So you ask me what kind of woman I am. I am the kind of woman who survived. I survived the cruelty of so-called civilized men. I survived the silence of my own family. I survived a winter that should have killed me. I learned to feed myself, to protect myself, and to build a home from nothing. And I found a good, honorable man who saw me not as something ruined, but as a person worthy of respect. She turned her burning gaze on the crowd. You all look at my husband and see a beast, a killer, but his hands, the ones you have put in chains, are the hands that kept me from freezing, that built our home, that protected me from the true animal. The one who wears a fine suit and buys his justice with money and lies. Elias Boone killed a man. Yes, but he did it to save his wife. He did it to save me. She sat down, her body trembling with the force of her own words. The courtroom was utterly, profoundly silent. The jeers and the mockery had vanished, replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable shame. The women in the crowd looked down at their hands. The men shifted in their seats. Judge Harrison stared at her, his stern facade gone, his face a mixture of shock and something that looked like deep, personal remorse. He looked at Mr. Abernathy, who was now sweating, his smug confidence replaced by a rising panic. And he looked at Elias, who was watching his wife with a look of stunned, absolute love. The judge cleared his throat, his voice thick when he finally spoke. In my 20 years on the bench, he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, I have heard many stories. I have learned that the law is a clumsy instrument, and justice is a rare and precious thing. Today, I have heard the truth. He fixed his gaze on Abernathy. Mr. Abernathy, your lawsuit to claim this land is dismissed. I find your testimony and your character to be contemptible. You are a disgrace to this court and to the name of gentlemen. He turned to the sheriff. See that this man and his associates are out of my territory by sundown. Then he looked at Elias. As for the matter of the killing, I find that you acted in the defense of your wife and your home. Elias Boone, you are a free man. Remove his chains. The ride back to the cabin was a quiet, surreal dream. The world seemed new, washed clean. The weight that both of them had carried for so long had finally been lifted. When they reached the clearing, spring was in full, glorious bloom. The wild flowers Clara had planted were a riot of color, and the new green leaves on the aspen trees trembled in the breeze. They walked to the door of the cabin, their cabin, and stopped on the threshold. Clara looked out over the land, the small garden, the stack of firewood, the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving mountains beyond. It's not paradise, she said softly. Elias came to stand beside her, his arm circling her waist, pulling her close. He looked out at the same view, at the life they had forged from ruin. It's ours, he replied. The next morning, they walked hand in hand to a sunny spot on the western edge of the clearing. In his hands, Elias carried a small apple sapling he had found growing wild by the creek. Together, they dug a hole in the rich, dark earth. They knelt side by side, gently placing the young tree into the ground, covering its roots, tamping down the soil with their bare hands. It was the first tree in an orchard that would grow over decades, its roots sinking deep, its branches reaching for the sun. They were survivors. They were lovers. They were builders of something beautiful. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.